Okay, looks like we got the bulk of folks in. So welcome, thank you for being here. My name is Julie Miller. I'm with the Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship, and we want to thank you for joining this webinar on what not to restart and opportunities moving forward, global engagement post-COVID. I'm just going to do a quick tech overview and then we will move on to the presentations. So if you experience any technical issues while you're in this webinar, please message me directly through the chat function. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. You're probably familiar with Zoom at this point, but just in case, remember that you'll have the options in your chat box to message all participants or individuals. So you'll be able to search for my name, Julie Miller, and then message me directly with any issues. If your connection drops out and you can't get back into the webinar, please email me and I will try to troubleshoot with you. You can respond directly to the email I sent yesterday that had the meeting link in it. And I'll try to remember to drop my email address in the chat after this as well. So today's webinar is co-sponsored by 3 membership networks at the Center for Peace and Global Citizenship here at Haverford College. We are members of the first 2 and we host the 3rd. Those networks are the Pennsylvania Council for International Education, also known as PACE, the Philadelphia Higher Education Network for Neighborhood Development, known as FEND, and the community-based Global Learning Collaborative, known as the Collaborative for short. While these 3 networks all have different missions, their missions overlap at the intersection of supporting diverse people, working together on campuses and in communities to co-create more welcoming, just, inclusive, and sustainable communities. Finally, we're also very excited that this webinar is part of our 20th anniversary series at the Center for Peace and Global Citizenship, where we're marking this year by reconnecting, celebrating, and visioning how we work across our partnerships to support peace, social justice, and global citizenship. So we have about 65 people here today so far, and over 150 registrants total. So as you'll see, you're muted by default for now. However, we do encourage you to use the chat feature throughout the presentation to interact with each other and drop in comments, affirmations, and questions. Of course, our aim with this webinar is to foster inclusive dialogue and sharing. So if there are any racist or discriminatory messages during the dialogue, we do retain the right to remove participants if necessary. But as I said, we do encourage questions and conversation in the spirit of advancing shared understanding. So this webinar is being recorded. You consented to that when you joined, but we just want to make sure you're aware. So feel free to have your video on or off, whatever you're comfortable with. And at the very end of the presentation, we'll share a very brief feedback poll, just so you can give some feedback about your experience today. So again, feel free to message or email me, Julie Miller, with any technical issues, and I will now pass the mic over to Dr. Nora Reynolds, who is Director of the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative and a Fellow at the Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship.
Thank you, Julie. As Julie mentioned, I'm Nora Reynolds. I direct the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative, which is a membership network hosted by the Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship. We support a range of learning activities and resources for community organizations and educational institutions dedicated to advancing critical, ethical, and aspirationally decolonial community-based learning and research. Today's webinar is actually an opportunity for us to reconnect with some old friends who have been helping us build alliances and make changes in this area of practice since 2014. That year, UNICEF, Save the Children, and the Better Care Network convened a gathering in London under the title Better Volunteering, Better Care, a strategy meeting for a global communications plan to prevent orphanage tourism. At that meeting, Eric Hartman, who is the co-founder of the collaborative and executive director of the Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship, met Martin Punax, an international development specialist with 20 years of experience supporting child welfare and anti-trafficking in relation to responsible tourism and volunteering. A year later, I joined Eric and about 30 other colleagues from around the world at Kansas State University Staley School of Leadership Studies' inaugural Leading Change Institute, where the topic of the gathering was ethical global partnerships, learning, and service. It was through that gathering that we were fortunate to meet Balu. Balu is an Indian author, public policy advocate, leadership trainer, activist, and medical doctor based in Mysore, India. He founded Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement and brings decades of insight as an activist and visiting scholar of leadership at a range of global universities. And Jackie Aridi is the Kellogg Institute for International Studies Regional Research Programs Manager for East Africa. Based in Nairobi, Jackie oversees the Forward Programs, Community Engagement and Research in Kenya and Uganda, supports Notre Dame students doing research or internships in the region, and builds relationships with regional partners. Today, as Julie mentioned, we had about over 100 total registrants, more than half of whom are from higher education sector based in the US. We also had registrants from K-12, the business sector, and the nonprofit sector. So just to get comfortable with using the chat and to see who's in the room together here today and where our energy is, why don't we all drop in a very brief introduction? We could go with work, location, and perhaps one opportunity you see emerging because of the COVID crisis. So just very, very brief. So I would say something like work with the collaborative in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the United States. And I think this allows for more frequent low-cost participation from multiple locations versus one-way travel. So I will pop that in. And I will give about a full minute or two for those of you who are here to drop in those introductions and read a bit about who is here in the room with us together. Great, and I encourage you, please continue popping those introductions into the chat as we go here. So I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Balu. Please, as a reminder, keep the energy going in the chat, whether it's affirmations, questions for later, complimentary information, or other ideas. So I will moderate from there. Balu.
Hi, Balu. There you go.
Sorry, I forgot I had to unmute myself. Thank you, Nora, and thank you, Eric, for having me over here, and thank you all the others for joining. It's good to see your old friend Genevieve also participating, and it's nice to say hi on this virtual platform. COVID has changed our lives. As a physician, I know that it surely changed my life and a lot of patients that I've seen and met. From the perspective of policy, from the perspective of any perspective that you can take, if there's any event that all of us can recall and feel equally vulnerable, equally susceptible, worried, anxious, and possibly searching for answers and solving a problem, this is possibly it. What global citizenship, with all our workshops, conferences, books has not achieved, a simple little virus is able to bring people together, even out of this strange feeling of fear and anxiety and all this kind of stuff. So I believe this adversity presents ourselves as an extraordinary opportunity, an opportunity which, if we see it as an opportunity, we could build on and capitalize. And the world of service learning is no exception to this. I think none of us have been insulated from what we're seeing. And I believe, for at least in my experience of close to being in the space of human development for nearly 4 decades and being in the space of service learning for more than a decade, I've never seen a leveler as strong and as powerful as COVID. And that's why I believe it's an exciting opportunity. The distinction between global north, global south, in the early days of my service learning work, I used to get extremely provoked and angry when people seemed to understand the problems we in India had, and people would come with prescriptions and solutions. And I would say, what the hell, what do you know? You don't even ask me what the problem is. You define my problem and then come up with a solution statement. But I think COVID is beautiful in that way. It has presented itself as a problem to all of us in a way in which none of us know what the problem is. We're still struggling to find out how do you define it, how do you frame it? And therefore, we're struggling to find out how do you solve it. And in this strained anxiety, it's leading us to form partnerships, because if we don't really turn to each other as equals, if we don't really look to each other for possible answers, I don't think we'll be able to not just solve the problem. And in that attempt to find those answers, we might actually find solutions to service learning too. So I see it as an opportunity to break down barriers of power, an opportunity to break down information asymmetries, and possibly an opportunity to learn from each other in the true spirit of partnership. So I think now for once, we all seem to have a common term of reference for both sides of the fence. So suddenly I see how equal we are, because we all feel equally vulnerable. We all feel equally in the need to reach out to each other, seek partners for solutions. You know, I still remember several years ago when I was designing a leadership course, and a student would ask, and they would ask before you take the course, they would write to me an email and say, will your course help me face the VUCA world? And I didn't belong to that generation. I never really knew what was VUCA. So I couldn't go back and tell my student, can you tell me what is VUCA so I can figure it out? So I just went and Googled VUCA. And then I realized it meant something which I thought I knew all the time. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I never realized that in my own lifetime, it will be a lived experience for most of us. I think COVID has really presented itself with all the volatility that it can bring, all the uncertainty of the future that we can think of. The complexity of the problem. Is it a health problem? Is it an economic problem? Is it a social problem? Is it an anthropological problem? Is it a zoonotic problem? Is it a policy problem? Is it a leadership problem? You can define it in so many different ways. So I think it's become a lived experience. So I believe we can actually fashion a great future, a great world, if we are ready to learn from these experiences. And the first learning that I'm not saying that's the only learning, each of us will have a perspectives, and I was trying to connect it. As a development practitioner, as a person who teaches development, I thought, could there in some way be some commonalities, some common threads that we can see and we can learn from, and therefore possibly teach the future generations, the younger generation, the student generation, lessons that we can pick from this opportunity. And I realized that we as mankind have created problems for us, and we are all very good at it. We seem to be creating newer and newer problems in different ways, and then we struggle to find solutions. And I think I could bucket them in three major boxes. The first bucket I would say is, we've been treating this planet with scant respect. We've been consuming resources at such an enormous, and we all know this, climate justice is a fashion statement. But for once, the impact of climate has hit every one of us. It's not something out there, somewhere far off in the Arctic, somewhere out there where the poles are melting. It's there every day in our lives. We have upset natural cycles, we have changed, altered the ecological patterns, we have made animal diseases a part of our lives today. That as a physician, when I did my medical school work, I never learned so many zoonotic illnesses. They're just a word in my textbook. Today, I need to study it again and again and again to understand how the natural cycles of diseases have been completely re-altered. So ecological crisis is a reality. I think the challenges of inequity too, the inequities that we have created for ourselves in the economic models that we have fashioned, the models of blind profit maximization, and therefore in that pursuit of the consumeristic cultures, scant disregard for everything else, whether it's human beings or the planet. And the society crisis of inequities in all its dimensions, the polarizations that we see, whether it's the United States and the problem of racism or the problem of conflict around the world. I think they're so intimately connected that we are not seeing the connection. Though I can describe it in three buckets, I think it's one seamless big problem statement. And the most important, and that is where the future lies, is the solution opportunity. And that is where the crisis of the self. We as human beings are forgotten to touch base with our own inner selves and the humanity that we can all discover within us. You know, we are actually living in a generation, and I'm sure these statistics hold good for I'll not be able to generalize it across the world, but generally young people. We today understand that close to 1 million people less than 25 around the world commit suicide. They're not able to find a purpose for their lives. They're not able to find a reason to exist. And that's so sad. A generation which can lead this world into a better space is a generation we are losing out in a large number. So I think the crisis of the ecological situation, the societal situation, the self situation is also something where it's manifesting itself as a COVID crisis in a different context. So I was looking at, can we now use this opportunity and the opportunity of service learning in the spirit of global citizenship in its true sense, where for once, globally, if we don't come together and find a solution, we will not be able to possibly have a globe to deal with in some point of time. So I believe that this is something we need to do. Can we sit together and reassess that service learning is not about just service. It's not about serving others. It's about serving ourselves in the pursuit of working with others. And I look at it as, how do we understand the self? How do you understand as ourselves at the individual level? How do you see ourselves at the community level? And learn to build two things, two tools, which I think should be part of the service learning toolkit for a student. Behind the cognitive academic experience, I think the power of reflection and the power to stay resilient. If we can teach our young generation this, I'm sure they will expand and build on it and look at how do we find solutions to this. So with that in mind, as an experiment, we work with 26 universities from the Vivekananda Youth Movement through a center called the Vivekananda Institute of Indian Studies around the world, mostly in the United States and a few in Canada and other countries of the world. We try to work with them to give them an experience, which is an experience of partnership, an experience of equal footing, an experience of actually we feel and reaffirm a sense of humanity rather than a sense of giving. So we try to kickstart not the provider mindset, but the kickstart a space where we relate to each other as human beings at a very compassionate level. And understanding this, we thought, can we actually recreate this experience in a virtual space? And it's extremely difficult. Now I'm teaching online this semester. I'm not in Ithaca as I would always be in the fall, but sitting in Mysore, trying to engage with students, I'm trying to learn the dynamics of a virtual environment. And trying to recreate this virtual space in service learning is not easy. But I have some wonderful colleagues with me who try to put it all together, and we just work with these two principles. Can we enable reflection in the pursuit of contributing? While contributing, not feeling that I'm contributing, but I'm actually learning about myself in that process and understanding that in serving society, I'm actually serving humanity and serving myself as part of that humanity. It's a big ask for an 18, 19-year-old to process, but I'm always surprised by these undergrads in the kind of work that they do. And the second is, can you teach them not to be anxious and insecure and frightened of the situation, but to build the resilience to cope with the crisis? Can you sort of embed that quality in them through this process of experiences? So students from Cornell, and so that's the only program we ran this year. Out of the 26 programs we ran, we could only run the Cornell program because they wanted to believe in this, they wanted to experience this, they wanted to actually share our experiences, and they're great partners to have. One of the few institutions which sees us as equal partners. And so we started looking at it and said, how do we do this? To a great extent, we could create a lot of reflection and resilience. But I really feel that there are challenges that we need to address. And I'm hoping to learn from all of you and your thoughts. We really would like to learn how to deepen this experience from the virtual space, from the immersive mindset. The physical immersion contributed so much. Coming to India, culturally immersing themselves, eating out of their hands, wearing a sari, going to the markets, getting used to our traffic, getting used to our population. Itself was a great experience for them. Can we really recreate it? Would VR help us recreate it? I don't know. How do you embed cultural experiences virtually? Can this be the new normative GSL program? How can you get people to have how do you replace the physical appreciation of humanity, service, and partnerships? Can technology be a leveler, or is technology a barrier actually? So really, we'd like to explore all this and begin this new exploration to see if we can explore the creation of a new economic order itself. We would like to explore, can we all work towards a for-benefit economy, where each of us bring value to this world, and we all create benefits for each other, and move away from this mindless profit maximization, which could be the problem initiator, to look at benefit optimization. So our journey is to lead us to this space of global citizenship where we can explore this together. So I'm going to stop here. I know I have 30, 40 seconds exceeded my time, but it has been great being here, and thanks Nora for reminding me about it. And I'll be around to possibly if you have any questions and if you have any points to help me learn more about this. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Balu, and we will turn it directly over to Martin to keep the conversation going.
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me start by just thanking Balu. That was an incredibly positive and inspiring talk, and hard to follow on from. But I agree with everything you've said. I think you've set the context really, really well there. I'm going to share my screen for my talk, so just give me a moment. Oops. So I hope everyone can see the screen okay. So my name is Martin Punax. I'm an international and development and child protection consultant with about 20 years experience. I've spent most of my working life working in the UK, India and Nepal, and also other countries as well. Let me start off by saying I'm a big fan of global engagement and service learning. I think it's really, really important for all sorts of reasons. In my late teens and early 20s, I did a lot of volunteering in the UK, India, Pakistan, Peru, and I'd be lying if I said that this didn't help me in terms of my personal career, but also it's been invaluable in terms of what I learned from those experiences in terms of helping me do my job better to support the communities that I work with. There's a photograph here of me when I was 19, volunteering in an orphanage in Peru, the days when I still had hair on my head, and it's kind of an ironic photograph because I now tell people, as for the last 10 years, I've been telling people in my job not to do what I did, not to volunteer in orphanages. And I'll tell you why. So I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour now of what the problem is with orphanage volunteering and orphanage tourism. Quick story, first of all. The photograph you can see here is of the girl with blonde hair. It's an Australian girl called Jessica. She was doing a round the world tour with another Australian girl called Nicole in 2006. And as part of that round the world tour, they did 3 months service learning or volunteering in an orphanage in Nepal, where they worked with a group of orphan children, playing with them, taking them to school and so on. They were really inspired by the lady in the blue outfit you can see on the right, called Gomuluatel, who they saw as this kind, caring, selfless social worker, and the work how she dedicated her life to helping these orphan children. And they, after 3 months, they left, went back to Australia, and to this day, I suspect they still don't know what was really going on in this orphanage. Let's fast forward 4 years. This is Gomuluatel, the orphanage owner. In 2010, she'd become a very wealthy woman by now, wore nice clothes, nice jewelry, had built a big house on the grounds of the orphanage from all the profits she was making from all these fee-paying volunteers and tourists coming to Nepal to work at her orphanage. But behind this facade she put on as this caring social worker, she was actually abusing the children, beating them, telling them they had to present themselves as orphans even though they weren't orphans, because this is what attracted volunteers and donors to the orphanage. And without going into lots of detail, the conditions were so bad that one of the children was actually killed in the orphanage. It was in fact murdered by Gomuluatel. This was covered up, but eventually the story came out because some of the children told a volunteer at the orphanage, and the volunteer reported it. There was a raid. The organisation I worked for at the time helped rescue the 20 children from the orphanage. 18 of these children we were able to get back to their families. They all had families that all desperately wanted to see them. They hadn't been allowed to see them while kids were at the orphanage. They'd been forbidden. The two children we couldn't get home, the only reason was that the paperwork had been faked. They were fake orphans. In short, these kids were poverty commodities. The only reason they were there is because there were people like Jessica and Nicole willing to volunteer in an orphanage to help with good intentions, but they were creating the incentive for traffickers like Gomuluatel to separate the children. Now, this is a particularly nasty example because it involves the murder of a child. Most examples of orphanage tourism don't involve children dying, but they do involve tremendous harm coming to children because they're being separated from their families, they're being denied their right to live with their families. And this is happening to tens of thousands of children around the world living in orphanages in lots of different countries. It's really easy to volunteer in an orphanage. Perhaps like me, you've done it yourself without realizing the problems. If you Google volunteer Nepal, this is what comes up. It's recommended to you to volunteer in an orphanage. If you go to the tourist areas in Nepal, this is what you see, adverts encouraging you to volunteer in an orphanage and help the orphan children and so on, do your bit to give back. But effectively, it's a business. It's a profit-making business where well-intentioned but naive families give their children to traffickers to put them in orphanages with the view they're doing the best thing for their children. They're trying to help their children get an education, and well-intentioned but naive foreign volunteers volunteer and give money to volunteer. and support orphanages because they think they're doing the right thing to help orphan children, whereas in fact they're creating the incentive for the children to be separated from their families. It's a travesty. And I don't want to suggest that all the people running orphanages are all traffickers or all murdering children. Most of them are not. Most of them are really good people that think they're doing the right thing, separating the children from their families, putting them in an orphanage where they can get a better quality of life, they can get an education, when in fact they're doing tremendous harm. There's 80 years of evidence to show that it really harms children psychologically, emotionally, even physically, to be separated from your families. Thankfully, a lot has changed over the last 10 years. There's been a lot of campaigns against this practice, targeting volunteers, targeting service learning organisations. There was a law passed in Australia. There's talk of law changes in the UK or improvements in the UK. A lot of volunteering companies have withdrawn from this practice. You can see here a headline about one such company. There have been university pledges to stop university volunteers being involved in it. I'll embarrass Eric now by saying he's done a lot of work in the US higher education sector around this. So a lot has changed. Now, I focused here on orphanage tourism, but there's very similar problems around medical voluntourism, certain types of medical voluntourism, and also certain types of animal conservation. So orphanage tourism and lots of voluntourism projects are very problematic. They're harming tens of thousands, if not millions of children, families, communities, and indeed animals as a result of good intentions gone wrong. But as a result of COVID, this is all unraveling at the moment. It's very interesting. It's unraveling practically because of restricted travel and restricted operational space in countries, and the volunteering and tourism sector just has been decimated. But also conceptually, the relationship between North and South is really changed as a result of COVID. As Balu said far better than I could, there's a level playing field now. We're all working on a common terms of reference. Wherever you are in the world, we can all relate to each other much better. There's a more equal dialogue about what we're all going through. There's a shared sense of empathy. We're all dealing with vulnerabilities and having to cope with uncertainty. I think particularly the way COVID has been managed in the global north, I'm going to pick on my own country, the UK. It's been managed pretty atrociously. And it's really put us in the spotlight of how we can't deal with emergencies in our own countries when we're going over to, where normally we're going to the other side of the world and telling people how to manage their emergencies. You compare that to, say, a country like Ghana, which set up a really good network of community health volunteers to manage an effective contact tracing system, and many other examples from the global south where it's been managed far better than the UK and probably the US as well. And also BLM, which has shown a spotlight on our own vulnerabilities. So there's a real need for humility by the global north. It raises questions, are we really more developed than the global south? Are we really best placed to be telling other people how to develop and advising other people? And I want to finish on what I see as some of the positives out of all this. What I'm seeing is happening in terms of changes that are happening. First of all, the Build Back Better narrative in the tourism industry and volunteering sector. It's very strong, a re-engagement with a message around responsible tourism, climate justice, human rights, diversity and inclusion, sustainability, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's what the market demands now, what customers want. Very similar with the volunteer tourism 2.0 movement, this idea that as aid collapses and there isn't as much aid, that lots of volunteers will need to go back to these countries in the future, that's their hope anyway. And there will need to be a much more meaningful engagement, better preparation of volunteers, a more level playing field, more balancing the power differentials and so on. That narrative has come up very strongly in the volunteering sector. I think what's really interesting is the refocus on the local. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I mean, things like BLM in the global north has really shown us that we have to deal with problems in our own society. We have to deal with those problems really before we can start telling other societies how to solve their problems. The rise in mutual aid groups. I got involved in my local mutual aid group. It's really made me realize how I've been used to I know all about the problems that pastoral communities in Garissa County and Kenya are facing, but I really didn't know about problems of people with disabilities and poverty living just around the corner from me, the problems they face. And I'm ashamed of that, but I didn't know these problems on my own doorstep. And it really brings into the spotlight that I perhaps should really know about that. And perhaps I should be dealing with those problems before I go off and tell Kenyans or Nepalese or Indians how they should solve their problems. And I think also in the global south, I'm seeing the fact that so many foreigners have left and advisors have left. It's creating a space for people to rise up to the challenge. So in Nepal, where I still have lots of contacts and still work, we're seeing, as a result of people like me leaving, we're seeing local government actually responding and being much more proactive in terms of dealing with child protection issues in local communities, which is really fantastic to see. They always had the potential to do that, but it was probably because of people like me being there that stopped them doing that. And I think we're seeing a less interventionist form of engagement, which links closely to what Bali was talking about remote engagement and so on. So I'm doing a lot of work in Kenya at the moment remotely, and I'm actually seeing a lot of the people I'm working with in Kenya being much more active because I'm not there, basically. They can probably do much better without me being there. It's more empowering. So I'm just going to finish now. Sorry, I've gone over a little bit by saying that even though these changes are happening, we shouldn't take them as a given. It's not a given that this is just going to happen and everything will change. There's a lot of people out there that want things to go back to normal, to go back to how they used to be. And I actually think there's going to be a conflict over the coming years about the direction we take. And this is why we must use our agency to make these things happen. And I'm going to finish by saying that I think that COVID-19 is actually the best opportunity we've had since World War II to change the world. So let's not blow it. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Martin. And we'll get started with Jackie.
Thank you, Nora, and thanks, Eric and Julie also. Thanks, Martin, for a very concise presentation. And thank you, Balu, also for really bringing out the power of reflection and resilience. As Nora mentioned, my name is Jacqueline Olocharidi. I work with the Kellogg Institute based out of Nairobi, Kenya, and I manage research programs. And I'm going to speak from a perspective of a university employee. So a lot of the people in the audience I hear are from a higher education background. And so I think a lot of the stuff that I talk about is normative, like how we'd like things to change and how we'd like to see the space of global service learning move. So the first thing that I'll discuss is the opportunities for learning that emerged this summer. When the COVID-19 pandemic happened in March, a lot of things stopped, as Martin mentioned, and everyone knows, the traveling and everything. But it allowed people to continue working virtually. And so institutions like my own, University of Notre Dame, continued to use virtual engagements. So we structured a lot of these engagements into virtual internships, virtual global service learning experiences, and we were able to connect students to the traditional communities that they've been working with over long periods of time. And we noticed that it can be done. Virtual learning can be virtual and people can communicate across contexts. And what really mattered and what really came out as a lesson were people communicating well, and were people conscientious on the agenda for the content of the learning? Were people still using the Catholic social traditions of engagement and solidarity? So those are some of the things that we learned, that it can happen virtually as long as people respect each other and people work towards the goals. Because some of these things are things that won't stop because of COVID. Some of the projects that the university is engaging in, like migration and refugees and people moving across the continents on the seas, are not going to stop. So we have projects like that that are documenting the Catholic Church's involvement in those kinds of endeavors that most governments don't want to touch. There have been stories about migrants being left in deserts to die and all that kind of stuff. But the Catholic Church has engaged in bringing people through channels that are more dignified. And so we've had student placements in this, and they've covered a lot in like websites, and my colleagues like Rachel Thomas Morgan and Grace Munene can speak to the blogs that the students gave, and some of the Kellogg Institute students also gave on their sites on how they thought that it would be different because it was virtual. But again, they weren't thinking that they'd change things, but they got changed because of being immersed into people's experiences. So I think there's a possibility for people to continue learning virtually, as Balu said. You can reflect in a Zoom call with someone over the experiences and in a very private way. So it just depends on how it's structured and what the agenda behind the learning is. So we as a university noticed that we can continue learning across contexts virtually, and it works, although there's some challenges, of course. I think colleagues, administrators have reported they have to follow up with students a lot more than normally, you know, people not logging in and stuff like that. So some of the challenges are there, but then the possibilities are there, as long as the key core principles that have been called for having community involvement and co-creating the programs are put together. Then still on the theme of opportunities, I'll speak about how the COVID-19 pandemic emerged as an opportunity. And I think Martin touched into some of the things that I wanted to say. Just because travel was grounded to actual destinations, it severely limited the power balance between the global south and the global north. And as somebody who lives in Kenya and works in Kenya and has been watching the approach as a public health person, I think there's some missed opportunities for learning, you know, like the power balance has been always people from the global north bringing capacity building, as Martin was saying, but now the global south had an opportunity to teach people responses, you know, because we've been in this space in public health where hand washing, malaria, bed nets, and all these interventions have always been imposed and the public health messages are there. I think it was very easy for people in the global south to adapt to a new normal, to start washing hands or to have curfews. You know, people just obeyed. You know, I think the responses were faster, you know, like the shutdowns, the lockdowns, the hand washing, the mask using, it just came automatically because we are always used to being told this is what you need to do. And I think a lot of outstanding responses, as Martin said, like in Ghana, people produce a low-cost test. In Senegal, they were the first to develop a immuno-based diagnostic test. You know, there was the whole Madagascar COVID-19 remedy. So if our team was working with a team in a global south country and a global north country, they needed to understand what was going on in this context and how fast it was for people to adapt. For example, like in Kenya, we had people who work in, like we are based in the informal settlements and we work with communities there. The level of hand washing machines that came up, you know, and mask was astronomical. Not even in the central business district were there that many hand washing apparel and infrastructure. So things just moved very rapidly. And I think there's an opportunity for learning across contexts. We know that the global north has been struggling. The public health response in the US and other places that are widely watched, like the UK, have not moved as fast. And so the question is, can we learn from the agility of policy responses from the South? I've not seen that conversation anywhere where somebody said, oh yeah, Africa got it right. Maybe we should learn from Africa. Maybe that's something that the classes need to teach and say, yes, there's times in the global South that people get these things right. Then my last point on the opportunities, the idea of the shift in power in terms of travel that happened with the travel restrictions, I think brought in this idea of a virtual space, and people need to use that to work on things like solidarity, collaboration, you know, resilience, and having conversations in these spaces. But they need to be, of course, structured so that, you know, these spaces are used for listening and learning. So I think all in all, in the opportunities existed, and we should see them and see them as the new normal and find a way of working into them. Then the second theme that we were asked to speak on was the deepening of, the understanding of the new normal. I think for me, the lesson here is if we'll still have students coming in for global service learning, there needs to be better preparation of the students that come in. That's my first lesson, the better preparedness of students that are coming from the global north. Because as people have seen, there's a lot of complexity in societies, and now a lot of things like Martin's mentions, Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matters movement has come in. We've seen Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and we're wondering to ourselves, have people in the global north reflected on these issues? If you're coming to deal with corruption in Kenya, but the bigger, wider social injustices in your country, has that been a conversation? And if you want to follow up on some of this, I think there's an activist in Kenya called Boniface Mwangi who visited the US, and he's talking to American students in a documentary, I think in North Carolina. It's called An African's Message for America. His thoughts were that he felt that the students were quite eager to come and look at child hunger, and there was child hunger in the US and stuff. And it's not throwing out the baby with the baby water, but it's also saying, can we also learn here in Kenya from Black Lives Matter? Like, are there ways that the police departments, police brutality, because it happens even here, police are very feared, but is there a way that we can learn from those approaches? And the second lesson is understanding from the community needs. Like, as I mentioned, of course, we need to see how responses happen fast. So can that reverse learning work, that this COVID-19 infrastructure and what processes made people adapt really fast in this context in African countries, can it be applied to the north? And even technologies like tracing and stuff, there's a lot that has been done. So we're, I think, calling for a more equal partnership where people learn, and also where people from the north promote like knowledge from the south and saying it's legit, they did it, they met the parameters, and it's right. So finally, how do we build better structures and programs? I think a lot has been said, but we need to decolonize service learning. The approach that the global north is always teaching the global south is changing. And all those people who have children have seen how quickly the children adapt to the online learning. So I think it's time for people to construct the idea of a global citizen and say, yes, we're on the right side of history, you can learn from us. Let's look at it from principles like solidarity, resilience, dignity, promoting dignity of people, seeing people as human, across, and saying, yes, we can learn from you also. And we'll write a paper on how maybe people learn from Madagascar, like the WHO has an African director from Ethiopia who's saying, yeah, let's do the research on this thing that Madagascar has produced. So I think there's that decolonizing, and then being intentional during service learning, that we are actually learning, and learning has to be objective. If somebody's right, they got it right, document it and learn both ways. Sorry, I think I've gone over 1 minute. I think those are my remarks.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And I see a few people popping some resources into the chat. We'll continue to do that as well. So we will turn over to Eric.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Balu, Martin, and Jackie. Really wonderful, all of your presentations. I'm so glad to be here with you. I'm going to share my screen as well, so just pulling that up. Excuse me. So again, thank you all, and thanks everyone for spending some time with us today, and I hope the chat conversation will stay robust. We'll certainly have some time for conversation at the end here. So I'm Eric Hartman. I'm the Executive Director of the Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship. At the center, at the CPGC, which we call it for short, we work to connect community-led and community-driven, carefully mentored student experiences with opportunities for students to actually do something of value that the community desired at the outset, that got us involved from the very beginning. One thing I appreciate about being at Haverford is a small liberal arts college immediately outside of Philadelphia. It has a historic Quaker affiliation, and that Quaker affiliation does encourage us to bring central questions of ethics and do so in a way that's discursive. process-oriented, and so we're regularly working to bring collaborators together on critical ethical questions. In the CPGC, one way that manifests is that we host the collaborative, the community-based global learning collaborative at Haverford College. And the collaborative, you've heard a little bit about today. It's a membership-based organization that's been around for nearly 10 years now. And one of its main kind of artifacts or outputs is fair trade learning as a process-oriented commitment that emerged really from a community in rural Jamaica, that was looking for better terms of engagement from Global North partners. And through partnership with that community and Matthias Brown, one of the leaders there, I and some others really networked some of the questions and expanded upon them in conversations with folks in Uganda, Bolivia, and across the US and around the world, and developed a set of commitments and queries and tools to examine partnerships around partnership quality and whether those partnerships exhibit, I'll try to reduce it to 4 main principles, whether they're community-led and community-driven in terms of learning and any projects. Are we sure the community desires at the center? Are they capital conscious? So in the great structure of higher education campus community partnership, global north-south, and Martin pointed out early in his presentation, perverse incentives are created when visitors have lots of resources that can create a desire, for instance, for the creation of orphanages in a really extreme example. So are they capital conscious and making sure that capital is moving through communities in ways that maximally benefit communities who are hosting? Are they credible in terms of how they engage things like service, if you're using that word, or in any case, community development partnerships? Is it credible in the sense of really utilizing expertise? So experts should be on tap, not on top, and thinking through how we engage with messages from UNICEF or Save the Children, like Martin shared earlier, as we also work with community-led programs. We're all working for credible ways of making an actual difference. And are they continuous? So community-led, capital conscious, credible, continuous. Continuous doesn't mean the student always has to be involved in that community. Continuous does mean that students should always be encouraged to be growing in a way that is beyond their single immersion experience program, right? So a single program, drop in, drop out, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to awaken people to interdependence, the way Balu spoke about it earlier. We are all part of something greater. If I learn well in my study abroad experience, how am I going to be changed as a person who's more alive and awake to our interdependencies locally and internationally as I move forward in the world? So I mentioned they're process-oriented and conversation-oriented because there are principles that people in various different cultural contexts will examine in different ways. So they're more flexible than hard rules because they have to be culturally and otherwise responsive. But there are a set of principles there, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later. I arrived 4 years ago at the Center for Peace and Global Citizenship, and the CPGC it's a wonderful place. I'm really glad to be at Haverford and at the CPGC, and we have this opportunity every summer to send 60 students around the world in 8-week internships that are definitely predominantly community-led. The history we have throughout our experience is always having community organizations invite. We don't place people places. We're making sure that we're aligning students' interests with community desires. That said, I wanted to admit to something that I think I know from the research. And in fact, a good colleague, Noel Sullivan at Northwestern, does this research. Most institutions are involved one way or another, have been involved within the last decade, certainly, in either orphanage tourism or medical tourism that shouldn't be happening. And that's because we all live in a hegemonic discourse that is biased because of centuries and centuries of white supremacy and other forms of structural violence. And so sometimes when people who are trying to help, they do so on top of discourses that they've inherited and haven't had the chance to reflect on deeply just yet. So when I arrived, we did an inventory of fair trade learning in our programs and thinking about whether the programs were community-led and were avoiding some of the worst situations around orphanage tourism. And again, more than 90% were in a great situation. But we did have a student come toward us, Maria Padron, who's pictured there in the top left of your screen, who said, I really feel like something I did last year in Nicaragua might have been like orphanage tourism. They weren't using the language orphanages, but it was a residential home, etc. And what should I do? So I'm sharing this story, one, because I think it's important that we all acknowledge that it's all around all kinds of institutions, but two, because it's a learning, like systems change happens through learning, and we can't just show up with rules and say everything has to change. So we dug deep into learning together. I didn't know the particular context especially well. It happened to be in Nicaragua, and it happened to be the case. What Martin shared is part of a global movement. So there's a major network all across Latin America dedicated to reuniting children with their families. The Nicaraguan government had just changed its law around residential care centers. The care center itself was in the process of shutting down as a result. So we learned all these things were happening on the ground that aligned with what we thought might be wrong. And we're able to not need to believe that we had to somehow step away from something that was going to maintain there. And the student did an independent study with a human rights professor and dug more deeply into it and spent a lot of time with it, really, and ended up doing a blog for Campus Compact as part of what the collaborative hosts, but kind of mobilizing her knowledge in particular ways. And this is important because if we're all thinking about how we reimagine, we have to be all co-learning and co-thinking together. As I was preparing for this presentation, it occurred to me that we do that fairly regularly in the Center for Peace and Global Citizenship. And it's more important than I realized until this presentation day. And we're always wondering, this is a screenshot of a short piece for a local social good publication that a colleague and I did together, Stephanie Keene. But it's one example among many. In our staff meetings with students in pre-departure, with students in courses, lots of different ways, we're regularly asking, what's our mission? What are the activities that we do? And how does that relate to outcomes? And regularly reviewing, like, what is theory of change? How do our partners advance theory of change? How do we advance theory of change? I think that's kind of packed in, well, I know that's packed into the fair trade learning principles. What's the theory of change for student development? And what's the theory of change with respect to community development, our community's desires in relation to the program? It might not be development, might be education. So another outcome of talking through these kinds of values and principles is that being at Haverford and arriving here, 4 years ago, that's not a long time in the sweep of institutional higher education time. So I was arriving and getting to know a lot of people. And I have a framework around fair trade learning, but it wasn't what had been growing partnerships there. But as I shared some of the values, we started to recognize that though we were using different language, a few partnerships were really exhibiting these values quite beautifully, I think. And I'm going to share a little bit about them as a way of helping us brainstorm. So we have a linguistics, it's a partnership through the linguistics program at Haverford College. And to make a very short articulation of it, over 10 years ago, a Zapotec man who was in Los Angeles knocked on the door of a graduate student at UCLA and asked about the co-creation of a dictionary. He and some of his friends had been advocating for their language to not disappear and trying to create dictionaries, but they wanted a linguist to help them through the process. That graduate student is now our associate professor of linguistics. Her name's Brooke Lillehagen, and through that partnership over many years, they've created an open access peer and community edited dictionary that our library helps to house. Our students work with Brooke and community activist leaders all through the year and every summer. And one thing about preparation, something that speaks to me so clearly, when we can find community-led and faculty-interested partnerships, preparation is always going to be baked into the curriculum because the faculty members got so many incentives to work that through. And that's certainly been something that's happened in the teacher project. Another partnership that did not emerge from, but exhibits many of the values of, and like the Oaxaca partnership and the Zapotec partnership, this partnership also has had now many moments of interaction with fair trade learning, and we've maybe strengthened some of the components of the partnerships through that interaction. But the Haverford has a relationship with Bryn Mawr. We call it the Bi College, so that's the BICO that you see, the BICO, Ghana Thinking Together, Lagin Tehetuma Action Research Fellowship. I chose to screenshot this page because it exhibits very well another of the characteristics of fair trade learning, that is, representation should from the very beginning be an educative opportunity. So when we think about how we promote our programs, are we doing that in ways that cement stereotypes or show, you know, a beach view or a mountain view that doesn't really have much to say about what's actually happening in this program? This program is so deeply rooted in exchange and co-learning, and that is so well expressed on this very brief summary and photo of it on this page. But 4 University for Development Studies students are in internships. They're from Ghana, with 4 students from Bryn Mawr and Haverford in partnership, and they do dialogue as they do their summer internships in Dalun, Ghana. They do dialogue about the relationships among history, identity, education, and liberation. Very structured carefully, but many deep relationships grow through it. There we go. One thing I didn't say explicitly at the outset, the Center for Peace and Global Citizenship is, has always been committed to local as a component of global. And this last example is another community-driven partnership. Puentes de Salud is a Philadelphia-based organization that serves and supports the migrant community in Philadelphia, particularly Latinx migrant community. As part of their mission, they're dedicated to educating the next generation of health practitioners on social justice and structural violences. So seeing their dedication to education, we realized we could partner pretty deeply and have done so through employee sharing and currently funding a one-year fellow with them through a deep relationship that has included their presence in community engagement courses in health, education, Spanish, and also a lot of co-curricular volunteering opportunities, so direct service opportunities. As I get to wrapping up here, I want to mention that when the pandemic really started to take hold back in March, in this particular relationship, Puentes de Salud started doing a rapid needs assessment throughout the South Philadelphia community and in respect to how their communities were being affected. And our students were involved with that despite our not knowing, right? Our students were asked because the relationships were deep and they needed bilingual people who could respond quickly and help them with that process. And I mention that because it occurred to me as I prepared today, one of the markers of quality seems to be, if everything changes, are the students still necessary? Are they still part of the theory of change? And Puentes has been heavily volunteer driven and carefully connected. But when we were reshifting and reshuffling all sorts of institutional things, the relationships between Puentes and many of our students were strong enough that they kept moving forward together. The same thing, well, not exactly the same thing, but what's striking when looking at the Ghana and Oaxaca projects I just shared, when we restructured to do remote this past summer, the projects stayed the same. The projects have always been community-led, have always needed students in particular ways, and that didn't change too much. We missed the full immersion, but the depth of community-led desire at the outset seemed really powerful for keeping us focused. So as I close up here, I want to emphasize there were two things that seemed to come through today, I think. One is, what do we just need to stop? I appreciate Martin's call to action at the end of his presentation, and his note that a lot of folks are going to want to restart exactly what has already existed in exactly the same ways. But we know quite well that there are things we should absolutely not restart: orphanage tourism, pre-professional medical volunteering. We might even expand our thinking to ask, what can we do that's more environmentally sustainable as we, and what length of stay should we have to require an international flight? Those kinds of questions should be the sorts of things we should be considering when we think about what might we stop. And what can we reimagine? What can we reimagine moving forward? So I am, as you know, I'm part of the collaborative and have been involved with fair trade learning. Something we've heard from institutions that have used fair trade learning is that it helps them to work through difficult conversations. And we just recently reimagined part of the collaborative, and we're asking anybody who feels called to this reimagining process and these commitments to sign on to the individual commitment, which articulates what this is about and what the aspirations are. And institutions that want to commit themselves to these principles to sign on to the institutional commitment. So we'll make sure that we drop that into the chat. And as I move to close here, thanks, Nora, for putting that into the chat. And Molly, yeah, thanks for that articulation. So folks, when you get off the call, you can take a look at those and see if it aligns with what you're doing. And we'll also be reaching out to people who sign to share just different community building opportunities. That's the last thing I'll say about this. Several of the institutions, centers, and offices involved who have signed up have told us, you know, sometimes it's hard to get my institution to pay attention to community and ethics. But when I can say that, oh, Northwestern did this, and Cornell did this, and Haverford did this, or East Carolina did that, it can help my institution see that there's some momentum there. That's the kind of thing we try to build. So we also get a lot of really tough questions, because these are tough issues, as I hope I shared we've struggled with as well. And I want to share a tough issue we got by email just to start the conversation now. So this is someone who couldn't be here today. She sent a note in. She said, Eric, I have one other question for you. In interest of wanting to sign the pledge and wanting to do it with full compliance, one question I have is with regard to the bullet point relating to work in orphanages. While, as you know, I subscribe to all the key elements related to volunteering in orphanages, the one position we have taken is that initiatives that provide services to schools or students in a region, which might include orphanage schools, should not negatively disadvantage children in those institutions against other local students. These are just a few initiatives, but do include a sports program that rotates between schools on different days of the week, a mobile computer literacy program that does the same, a couple of gardens, agriculture initiatives that work within sites that include but are not exclusive to housing for children in care, and various after-school clubs that invite participation from all local children, including those living in orphanage facilities. If the consensus is that by taking this stance we should be excluded from the pledge, I understand. This decision was not made lightly. It was made in the interest of including children in care situations and wider community benefits after concerns that their exclusion was disadvantaging them against their peers. So that came in yesterday. I was able to share it with the co-panelist colleagues. We're really excited. If you have other questions, comments to drop in, I think Nora's been watching them, but keep doing that. But Martin, I feel like teeing toward you makes sense given your presentation, but curious if anyone else wants to weigh in after as well.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, really good question, and I get a lot of questions very similar to this. The question is, what is an orphanage school? I think sometimes when we're talking about children's homes, orphanages, people get quite caught up in the terminology of, well, mine's not an orphanage, it's a children's home, or this is an orphanage school, it's not a normal orphanage, and therefore it's different. there's about, I could probably reel off about 10 different names for different types of children's homes or institutions, but effectively they're all, we would, in the child protection sector, we would consider all of them to be institutions. What is an institution? That's the question. Well, an institution, according to an EU definition, which is used a lot in our sector, is that it's a type of residential facility for children that separates children from their families and communities and forces them to grow up in an institutional culture where they don't have sufficient control over their lives and they don't have individualized care. And it doesn't matter what you call it, if that's the environment you're growing up in, you're growing up in an institution. And an orphanage school would fit that description most probably. There's actually 80 years of evidence to show that when children grow up in these kind of environments, it's very, very harmful for them psychologically, emotionally, even physically. They even have smaller brains as a result of it. And whilst the intentions of the people who volunteer in these places, the person who asked this question, I've no doubt are very, very good intentions. They want to help the children. And the chances are that people who run these orphanage schools, that their intentions are very, very good. The reality is that the evidence shows that the children growing up in these places, it's probably causing them harm. That's just the reality. And there are alternatives out there that children can grow up in. They don't have to grow up in these places. If you redirect the financial support from those places to families and communities, there's more than enough money for the children to grow up and support for the children to grow up in families and communities. And this has been proven over and over again in many countries around the world on many projects. There's lots of evidence for it. There's also the UN Conventions of the Rights of the Child, and I could reel off many more international laws and national laws support this idea that children really should be growing up in families and not in institutional care. So whilst I don't doubt the good intentions behind the person that asked this question, my response would be, if you really want to change the system and you want to change the incentive so that children are incentivized to grow up in families and communities keep them there, and NGOs support families and communities and not institutions, so that families and communities thrive and institutions don't thrive, then you shouldn't really be supporting those sorts of projects. You're better off supporting projects where you're keeping children and families in communities where they should be and where they thrive.
Now, I'm curious, well, I don't know, Nora, if you saw other questions, but in the event that, just sticking on that for a second, I think one thing that's come through in a lot of these conversations, there's this tension in some of what we're saying right now, or there's an appearance of tension, right? There's community-driven, community-led, and then there's, Martin, I hope you don't feel any offense when I say when Martin speaks that you might see UNICEF and UN and you know, just heard reference to the rights of the child. So how does community-led relate to this sort of structure of authority, 80 years of research, et cetera? And Balu might have something to add in here as well, or Jackie. I do know, Martin, that you work with advocates from around the world, so that's part of it. There's many local advocates who are seeing in the same way. But I'm curious, Balu or Jackie, if anything's striking you regarding this sort of working with external expertise and making sure there's fidelity to community-led initiatives along the way. And Balu, I think you're going to have to unmute. There you go.
Yeah. You know, framing the problem has always been the issue that I wrestled with. You know, framing it from a local context means that local voices are heard. And when you allow an external agency to start framing your problem, they obviously frame it based on the competence they bring to the table. It may not necessarily be the right way of framing the problem. They frame it in a way in which they have an answer to the problem. So this is where I strongly believe that you've got to have a local agency to start framing the problem. That being said, we also cannot presume that the local agency working with the communities or the community organization itself has a talent bandwidth to articulate the problem in a manner in which the external people can understand. So I've seen both the problems happen. I may know the problem, but I may not be able to articulate it in a way in which the other person understands. So there's a translational loss in the way I articulate it. The other side of the equation is when they don't understand the context and they don't understand the situation, and they start framing the problem in a situation where they think they have the solution for it. So they force fit my problem into their solution framework. I think both these challenges are something I've seen. So I'm not talking only in the context of tourism related to orphanages. I'm also talking in the context of medical tourism. You know, it's very strange. I'll give a small example and stop there. When several of the medical students would come, not just pre-med students, but actual doctors and other medical students or residents would come to work in our hospital, they would come with a prefixed idea that they're actually coming to help. They have framed the problem in such a way that medical expertise in India is not available, without even considering that we produce the highest doctors in the world. If we didn't export our doctors to the United States and other countries, you guys would have a problem. Right? And how could somebody coming from that country even presume that you are coming here to help me solve my medical manpower problem? It's completely unrealistic. But they have been framed to think in that perspective, right? That we are a suffering country. We might have a problem of the inadequacy of doctors trained within India to actually address rural health problems. We actually have a challenge where we train doctors because of labor market migration issues. They actually get better paid in the United States, so they migrate there. It doesn't mean that we don't, in a sense, America's policies of welcoming doctors itself is a problem for India, in one perspective. But these are issues which are not discussed, not understood, not spoken about. So the way they look at it. The second context I want to bring in the medical issue is, they talk about working in resource-limited settings. I think that's a false construct. I reframe the statement and say, we are teaching you to operate in circumstances which actually makes optimal utilization of resources. Your country is understanding wasting resources. Your medical systems are expensive, or healthcare systems are outrageously expensive. You're just funneling your economy, you're not looking at efficient utilization of resources. Here is an opportunity where you can utilize resources efficiently. So when I frame it locally, and because I have the ability to transform it into a statement which doesn't have a translational loss, where my intent is clearly communicated, I can do it. But I don't see several organizations having this ability to do it. So I see both sides. I just want to use this example to communicate that.
Thanks so much for your response, Balu. Jackie, go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, I think just to add on, I think in a country like Kenya, when UNICEF or one of the UN agencies has a position to take, there's a lot more attention with the media giving it, you know, like a lot of attention. But I think the key issues in the issues of orphanage, tourism and all that is government regulation. More Kenyans would listen to it if it came from local expertise. And I think a third way that would be better is research, because people are starting to consume research knowledge that is produced locally more and more at the university level. So research partnerships that bring local researchers in partnership with the people who've done 80 years worth of research, because knowledge is universal, might be given more attention and platform on issues that are local. Because when people see UNICEF, they see them in bed with the government, and some of these governments are not trusted. You know, there are different relationships. I know people have different political configurations, and so when people see the government, their reaction is biased towards the political landscape of the day. So I think research and universities have a middle ground whereby people can do a study, because nobody knows, like regulation comes from government. You can't know whether an orphanage is doing good, or Nyumbani was abusing children, or, you know, you don't know what goes on. Some of the things come in the media and people are like, oh, we thought that they were treating HIV orphans, but it turns out that the director, nobody knows. So I think the third way is having universities as, you know, producers of knowledge and a unique platform coming in partnership, of course, with the other organizations to tell this story for local consumption.
Eric, can I just add a real quick point onto what Jackie's just said? I'm really glad you raised that point, Jackie, about people not necessarily giving a lot of credibility to UNICEF and so on for good reasons. And I'm working for UNICEF at the moment, so I say that as a current insider. But But yeah, it's interesting. I'm doing some work at the moment in Kenya through UNICEF around care reform, about trying to persuade families why children should stay at home and not grow up in orphanages. And I totally agree with you. This is the reaction we're finding, that you talk about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the work of John Bowlby, a British psychoanalyst who did the research on this 60 years ago. And people are kind of like, yeah, whatever. We've heard all this before by other British people or Americans coming in and telling us all this. But what we are finding is that actually we're talking to a lot of community leaders and cultural leaders from the 47 communities in Kenya. And they will all say, well, this is exactly what we used to do, actually, before the British came in and messed it all up, and before our government messed it all up. We were very pro-family-based care. We looked after children in our communities. This is our community's ideology. These are our values. These are our traditional practices. And actually, this kind of narrative and these kind of ideas are much more powerful than talking about United Nations conventions. And in fact, this is not my idea, but this is what local people want to do. This is what they want to really focus on in terms of our strategy, to focus on the work of faith leaders and the work of community leaders, and what they are saying about this, much more so than what the UN's saying about this. And I totally agree, and that's the best way forward.
Just Kate Abney posted a question in the chat, and I think it relates a little bit to the initial question Eric posed around how do we navigate within the institutions where we work to push forward and pursue ethical engagement and work. And so this is really interesting because we're hearing a lot about how we communicate and ensure participation of local actors when we think about what the incentives are here around orphanage tourism. And so I'm curious how the panels would respond to many who are here on this call are situated within institutions of higher education in the US, and they may want to be putting a halt to a lot of this work. How do they navigate the tensions when they are operating in an institution that may have limited political will to change how these processes are happening, and the pressures that they're getting around, bottom line and student satisfaction and the experiences that students may want? And how do we work to push forward this work with that constituent? So we're hearing about kind of local actors and families making decisions around institutional care. How do we think about navigating this tension within institutions where we may be positioned in our current roles? And that, I think, could
Kate, that's one of my favorite challenge questions. So thank you. And I'll share 3 examples and a resource, and let's see what others have to share as well. So I got to know most of the folks who are on this panel through Kansas State and through my role there in the Staley School of Leadership Studies. And I'm mentioning that because one of the things about large institutions is they're massive, they're cities, right? So you can only start in your own little community. And I know you're, I think, perhaps in a role with international ed looking across the institution, but many of our colleagues think about, okay, I have 7 schools or 12 schools, whatever it is in your instance. How do I go one at a time, discover where the green lights are in terms of faculty members who are supporters, or even maybe deans or directors who are supporters? And at Kansas State, the Staley School was very much in favor of advancing how we do ethical engagement. That's why we convened, we were able to use funds to convene a conversation. But also we reviewed our programs, and we only had a handful, but we did have a handful of programs within the Staley School, within the whole range of offerings at Kansas State. And we changed our programs at the Staley School as a result. That's one example, but I'd also offer Minnesota. The University of Minnesota has really done incredible work with global health, and they looked squarely at this challenge and said, you know what, we're going to mobilize an open access free resource so that any student of ours, and in fact, any student anywhere who wants to have access to really good preparatory work can access that through our resources in our system. So they took a leadership role, and now lots of people are looking at them as a result. I put some of this stuff into a blog once, which I'm just dropping in there. But the other thing is Cornell University has been a major leader in this work as well. I got to meet Balu through Cornell, thankfully. And they're working through a real deep, they've been working through for a long time. They're the only land grant institution that's also an Ivy League institution. And so they take seriously experiential learning in a particular kind of way. they've been working through their criteria on what is engaged learning, and having off-campus leadership, I believe, is showing up in their criteria. So it's all comes down to these questions of how do we arrange, coming back to the beginning of the question, this is something that's relevant for small institutional or large institutional change. How do we arrange the application document? How do we arrange the funding document? What are our standard operating procedures? Do we ask for an off-campus, letter of invitation? How much does that weigh? Does it show that something's community-led before we will spend staff time or resources on it? So, I mean, this is a massive problem, and I'd love to keep working with everybody on the call on it. But I'll stop there and see if others have things they'd like to add as well.
I just want to reference that, connect that also back to the commitments, the individual and institutional commitments that we popped into the chat earlier. This tension, I think, in many ways actually is one of the reasons we created the collaborative, is that we often found that folks felt like they were operating sometimes in isolation in institutions, and were seeking a way to kind of speak and pressure sometimes as more of a collective voice. So if I'm the director of a center, but I'm saying on my campus, it's not just me or Nora pushing these issues and considerations and questions. I'm a part of a network. We are a part of a network that is pushing these questions in a way that it's not just coming from me, but is coming from a network that's a network that is composed of other institutions to kind of create pressure points for conversations in different ways. So that is one of the goals of those kind of commitments, is to also create those dialogue spaces in institutional contexts to speak with more of a collective voice to these issues. I'm reading some of the chats too.
Yeah, and just to build on what Nora was saying, having communities of practice on campuses, which are maybe, on campuses we often have, or we used to have pre-pandemic, and I guess now we have to do it on Zoom, but we used to have coffees and sandwiches together an awful lot on campuses. And adding some real systematic thinking around what it means to bring together a community over time on a particular challenge through this literature on community of practice is a way that a number of institutions have been working through that. Also, just wanted to nod toward Molly's question or comment. Might this be a way that other entities can be drawn in? I think we've seen some of that through the ways that in the education abroad sector, in any case, Nora, maybe, well, I guess we're running near the end of time. So I'll just say quickly, I thought Nora did really interesting work with the Fair Trade Learning Principles, asking constituents in Nicaragua to respond to the principles separately, without her, and to kind of rate. And then she's in a role where she was the kind of US side in that partnership in some ways, or one of the parts of the US side. And so she rated, they rated blindly. They got together and they said, okay, are we seeing this the same way? We're seeing it differently. How do we work forward? So it's an invitation to conversation, I think, rather considerably. This may be a good spot, Julie, to drop in survey. And I guess we have 3 more minutes. Julie's going to share a survey link. We're really, really love your feedback. We organize this in the hope that it's beneficial to you and to us in terms of shared learning. And we would just really appreciate if you take literally 30 seconds and fill that out. Before we close, does anybody have any burning questions or concerns? And even if you drop them in right now, who knows, it might inspire a blog or a newsletter in the future or a future webinar, right? So even if we don't get to it. And as we're seeing, as we're looking for that, I'm curious if the panelists might want to each close with one hope in this pandemic. Could be a portal sort of moment, but it certainly would be a portal we have to fight for.
I would simply say this is an opportunity for partnering for public good.
I really hope that this conversation goes beyond our normal social bubbles and it goes out to people who perhaps don't normally agree with us, and we can start to change hearts and minds there as well.
I think I'd also say that the partnerships have to be strengthened and community voices heard more, but also reconciled within institutional settings where things are more complex than they seem.
That's right, and I share those hopes and would say I think it's a real opportunity to start building higher education around where student and faculty resources might be most useful in relation to community-led desires and really creating the kinds of sustainable and inclusive world I think we all want to live in. Thank you very much, Martin, Balu, Jackie, and Nora and Julie as well for what we were able to talk about today. And thanks to everyone for bringing their comments. And I hope we will stay in touch, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nora.
Thank you.
Thank you.